Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
Deepa Kannan is a Yoga Acharya for over 2 decades, a functional nutritionist, and a certified food and spirit practitioner. She brings together 2 decades of her experience in therapeutic and transformational yoga and deep learning in functional medicine nutrition to her practice in PhytoThrive. A special thanks to Deepa for going the extra mile and doing this recording from her car because the studio was closed due to coronavirus restrictions. So Deepa, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Doctor.
It's an honor. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you started on the path you're on and what drives your passion?
Well, it's a very, very long journey, and I'm 43, and I think it all started because I had a whole childhood of severe health challenges, skin issues, autoimmune issues, and nobody was ever able to figure it out. And pretty much later, when I went through an 8-year bad marriage and my health literally went for a sixer, so to speak. And by the time I got divorced, I think I felt as if I had been destroyed physically and emotionally. And I started to think, though, that the level of stress which I had been through those 8 years, why was I not like a lot of people around me who were struggling with anxiety and depression? I didn't actually go down that route, but it attacked me physically. And it took me quite a bit of time to recover from that. And that was a long journey, but I think I've been teaching yoga for 2 decades now. And yoga had a great deal to do with keeping me sane through these very difficult times. And subsequently, after my divorce, I married a fellow yogi from the Himalayas, and we had a little boy. And I think that's really where my journey took a turn, because my child was born with an adrenal disorder called salt wasting congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where the kids don't produce cortisol and aldosterone. And we speak so much about cortisol as probably in a negative manner, because everyone's talking about how elevated cortisol can be responsible for inflammation. But in his case, he didn't produce cortisol at all. And I started to notice that there was a pattern that for the first year of his life, we'd perpetually be running into the emergency room. And salt wasters, because they don't have aldosterone, they lose copious amounts of sodium. They can actually dehydrate and die in a few hours of vomiting, diarrhea. And I started to ask the doctors here in India, does food play a role in this? Does it help to manage his condition, or does it help to prevent crisis? Because he was going through so much of this, and every episode where we were in the emergency room, he would be on triple dose of IV steroids to get him through that stress. And doctors typically here tend to say food doesn't play any role in anything. So I started to dig a little deeper, and I felt in my gut, because our ancestors do speak, grandmothers have said the gut is at the center of everything. If you've got faulty digestion, it's going to make you sick. So I started to think, what if all this is actually true and there's a science to it? So I went back to learning, and I became a certified nutritionist. And then I discovered this magical space called functional medicine. And that was a long journey of training with different people in nutrition based on the principles of functional medicine, and then I set up this practice here in India called Fight to Thrive. And functional medicine in India is very, very new, so when you speak about it, people don't really understand, because nutrition is all about calorie counting and restriction, calculation, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about understanding systems, working on systems, understanding that interconnection of different systems, organs, looking at root causes. And through this all, I found that I suddenly reached a point after several decades where I was symptom free, and a lot of severe chronic challenges suddenly just went away from simple interventions and changes in diet and lifestyle. And then I started to apply this even to my son, and started to see that his hospitalizations reduced. So we haven't had a hospital stay for a very long time. And then once you start applying to the client population and see that people who are struggling with several challenges, suddenly they seem to be much better, and they're no longer having these patterns of falling sick. And one of the things, doctor, I think I really believe in today is that people tend to think that it's all right to get a fever, cold, a cough every 2-3 months and take antibiotics for that. And I truly have reached a place where I believe that you do not, even falling sick, even getting a fever is unnecessary, and it probably will not happen if there's a balance going on within your body. So that's a short version of the whole journey.
So you mentioned Phyto Thrive. It's PhytoThrive.com. And what's the bulk of your work? Because I know you also do the yoga.
Yes, so the bulk of my work is with Phyto Thrive, and now a lot more focus on sleep, nutrition, and working with clients who have chronic sleep challenges. And that's also why I've got my podcast, which is the Sleep Whisperer podcast. But the bulk of the work,
let me interrupt you, because I
yes,
want to hear that. Your podcast is called what?
the Sleep Whisperer podcast.
Okay, excellent. Sleep Whisperer. Okay.
And I think the bulk of my work, the area now I specialize is in detoxification, women's health, skin health, adrenal function, and sleep.
And so is it that you're using a nutritional approach to restore people to a healthy, functional sleep pattern?
Yes, in nutrition and a whole lot more, I think, because I do include a lot of therapies, and there is this intersection that I believe, which I bring into my practice, which is the meeting point between ancient Eastern wisdom therapies and this cutting edge science of functional medicine. So using various tools from yogic science and different Ayurveda, ancient wisdom, herbs, therapies into the space of healing, so that you allow the body to come back to a state of balance and optimal function.
So when you have someone come to you, do they come to you for a general evaluation? Do they come specifically with certain chronic or acute illnesses? What's the way people find you most?
So typically, I think right now we've reached a point where people are coming because they've started to understand that this space of functional medicine and nutrition is for more chronic health challenges. So typically we don't get somebody coming to me saying that I want to just lose 10 kilos or pounds, or it's more that they've been struggling with, nobody's been able to identify why are they having skin conditions that are autoimmune, not getting worse, constant bouts of anxiety and waking up at night at 2 a.m. where anxiety peaks and soars, and then they're unable to fall asleep again. Lot of chronic women's health challenges, which can range from all ages of women, including young girls who have early puberty, women who struggle with every symptom that's related to imbalance in women's health, early menopause, and all the mental health symptoms and challenges that women struggle with, including anxiety and depression, specifically if it's cycle related. And one of the things that I'm really vocal about in India is that there are a lot of people who are working for mental health, but when asked about, do you assess people before you diagnose them with something like a bipolar disease or clinical depression, do you even look at these under the hood root causes, possibly hormone imbalance, thyroid imbalance, nutrient deficiency of critical nutrients like iron, B12, folate, and a lot of people working in the mental health space, they say that these things come after the diagnosis. So they're typically diagnosing a woman with depression while she has deficiencies of iron, B12, she's got severe estrogen dominance, but they're not considering these as the root causes of what's happening within their mind. So they're diagnosing them, putting them on antidepressants, and then very few of them even go down that space of understanding these things, doctor. And recently I had somebody come to me who was a young girl, put on SSRIs for a long time and birth control pills, and then she wasn't told how to wean herself off, so she stopped suddenly, and she had this rebound serotonin attack where she had symptoms which were worse than when she was put on the
Right.
medication. And
Yeah. It's a very
she just,
common story. Yeah.
yes. So I think we just need to bring a whole lot more awareness into looking at root causes, physiological root causes of inflammatory markers and deficiencies before we diagnosed somebody with an actual mental health condition. And I'm not saying I'm against medication or against somebody being diagnosed. I absolutely believe that everybody should get the necessary help in whatever way they can, but I feel that these should be addressed before you go down that route.
Well, and because you mentioned this, the really strong negative rebound effect that this young woman had because she went cold turkey off of a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. This is a common medication to try and improve mood for people.
Yes.
I want to mention that Dr. Peter Breggin, who has been writing about this stuff for decades, has a book specifically about how to withdraw from the psychiatric medications. And one of the key things he talks about is how important it is to be actively reading the specific symptoms of the person you're working with rather than go by a formula. Well, first we'll cut down 5 milligrams and then 5 and then 5 and then 10. To be very actively assessing the person and to go what some people would call, many professionals would call, ridiculously slow in withdrawing. And he has found that's essential for some people to avoid that negative rebound effect, you're calling it, that negative impact of stopping one of those psychotropic meds after a person's been on it for a period of time.
Oh, interesting. I think I must get my hands on that book as well.
Well, it's highly recommended. I had the honor of interviewing him earlier in the year. He has a podcast that you can listen to for free on the On Your Mind podcast. But I wanted to get back to you and ask, what kind of assessment tools do you use to determine if someone has these vitamin deficiencies or these thyroid or hormonal imbalances, et cetera?
Well, we have long assessment process. So our pre-screening is done with a 30-page long intake form, which is broken up into different endocrine systems. So we have questions related to adrenal health, reproductive health, digestion, circulatory system, thyroid, brain health. So there's first a lot of questions related to it, and then we do a 2-part screening process where we meet the client and go through a further detailed assessment, talking to them, and run a series of serum labs and assess the labs from the perspective of functional medicine rather than from some typical range. So we provide a client at the end of this 2-part assessment with 4 assessment forms, like a blueprint of what's going on within them and a detailed functional lab analysis, providing the range for them, giving them a lot of information on what does that actually mean, and showing some correlations between different systems. For example, an elevated LDL or triglycerides does not always just mean high cholesterol. It can be inflammatory markers. It can be related to liver health. So at the end of this long assessment session, we have an idea of where to begin. But that said, I'm very conscious that I don't work short term with anybody. So our program is always 8 months because it does take time to tease more information out and work on systems in a systematic and sequential manner so that you get the person to a state very gently. So baby steps moving forward rather than shocking somebody into saying, hey, you need to do all of this today.
So it's an 8-month program that you work with people. And when with getting those serum labs back and doing your evaluation, do you then work with a particular pharmacy to get specific compounds developed for the person, or do you just prescribe them to go out and get the vitamins the way they would what most other people would? How does that work?
No, so in India, we don't really have the option of creating your compounded nutrients as yet. There was somebody who started that, and then I found that I couldn't really trust somebody unless you've done a lot of work with them. So typically what I do in India is that I have a certain specific brands which I trust. So I give some recommendations to stay within those and not to go outside of those. And there are some excellent brands of nutrients like pure encapsulations which are accessible even in India. So I make some recommendations, but I must admit that I'm not a part of any of those. So I don't have any financial aspect there. So I just give general guidelines for how to choose and what to pick, but I don't specifically work with somebody myself.
Okay, so then on top of the nutrients, you mentioned that you blend different modalities. What are some of the other modalities that you recommend for people?
Yes, so that can vary from person to person, case to case. But as an example, let me say I wrote an article on glymphatic health and using ancient tools for supporting brain health, which was very well received. And Dr. Mark Hyman also shared that article. So that I spoke about how you need to go back to some of our ancient therapies to improve brain function, which includes weekly oil massage on the head to activate circulation. There's a therapy called Trataka where you sit down in the darkness and stare at a candle flame until your eyes water profusely, which is related to also relieving lymphatic congestion and helps with circulation in the brain. And also things like using an olden days sitz bath for women's health and for challenges with digestion. So just sitting, immersing the pelvis in some level of heat so that you're allowing for any stagnation of lymph in the pelvis to circulate and to just improve blood circulation overall. Then age-old remedies like enemas, which of course in clients in the US who don't feel comfortable doing that, then I just suggest that they go and do a little bit of colon hydrotherapy. So anything to support the body in its own process of detoxification and improvement of circulation, anything like that.
Okay. So how do we access the article you wrote on the brain health?
It is on phytothrive.com. If you do a search on glymphatic health and ancient tools, the article will pop up. It's also there on Dr. Mark Hyman's Facebook page. If you Google this, if you just search the same subject, but I can also send it to you if you want to link that, because
Okay.
it's got
Well, I'll find it. I'll find it, but I want to make sure that people listening have a way to get access it on your website. So, and of course, Dr. Mark Hyman is very well known for functional medicine. I like to ask people like you who practice in that for your way of talking about functional medicine. How do you explain that to people? What's the difference between the traditional medical model that we might find here in America and what you're trained in as functional medicine? How do you talk about it?
So there is the easiest way that I explain this to people, and I have to keep repeating this several times during our journey together because it does take time to really understand, and oftentimes people go back a few months later and they've not really they don't understand why something is happening, because you don't judge something in this process until the very end, because you're working system by system sequentially. So the easiest way to say is that think of a pebble dropped in water and how when it goes down, the mud comes out. So if you look at your body as if it's you've thrown a boulder in and the mud is churned up, you can't see what's going on. So the first thing that you do is to just try and recognize what are inflammatory to this person, and these could include general inflammatory foods, but it could also be specific inflammatory aspects for different people. So recognizing this and just removing some of this for a while, which is also the process Ayurveda would use long ago, to remove all the heavy to digest foods for a while so that the body just calms down, digestion is eased, and then you know what's going on. And I'm not saying that's the ultimate way of healing. That's just the stepping stone to start to understand what's going on a deeper level. So you remove all that's inflammatory. And I think one of the things that I speak a lot about because of my connection to my son's adrenal disorder is that stress plays such a massive role, and there's nothing as inflammatory as stress. So if somebody is doing everything possible, the best diet, they've got the best nutrients to support, but they're in a toxic environment, or they're not giving themselves enough space for lowering stress and improving their resilience to stress, then that is a major prevention towards healing. So first is just removing all these inflammatory aspects, including stress. And then, of course, seeing what are you deficient in. Now, when we look at that, it's not just about serum blood markers and just prescribing nutrients. You could be deficient in calmness. You could be deficient in having time for yourself, deficient in sleep, which is really inflammatory. So just removing what's inflammatory, seeing what is this person lacking, and trying to restore some of that balance to it. And then starting to see, once you've removed everything that's potentially inflammatory, is the person still showing signs? And I do come across, I must say this because I don't see a lot of practitioners talking about this, that in the last 1 year, I've worked with several people who have turned out to be histamine intolerant. And I think elevated histamine plays a huge role in anxiety. So sometimes it's just as simple as there was this one woman who had skin issues and anxiety, and she had tried everything. She had spent so much money on skin treatments, and it was as simple as removing histamine foods, and her anxiety went down, her sleep restored, and her skin healed.
Amazing. And as you were talking about things that might be missing or low, when I might be deficient in something, um, my mind started to click through with, sense of connection, sense of purpose in
Yes.
life, sense of
Oh,
love.
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, talking about that, doctor, is that was what was, I think, my biggest issue in my 8 years in my previous marriage, because it was so lacking in connection, and it was so a sense of, I was in a space of fear and not feeling safe, and nothing would help. I must have been through antibiotics 3-4 times every year, and I would always be sick. So you're so right about that. In fact, I've written extensively also on this. There is this antagonistic relationship between cortisol and oxytocin. So if cortisol is elevated, oxytocin drops. If you're exposed to oxytocin, cortisol drops. So therefore, if you are in a situation which is spiking cortisol and you lack oxytocin, then you're going to be inflammatory. But at the same time, if you're in a space, as you said, nurturing community, and you're raising oxytocin, then oxytocin elevation drops cortisol down. And oxytocin elevation, I don't want somebody to think that if they are in a space where perhaps they don't have somebody who makes them feel safe or loved, that they can't heal. Because I also found that if somebody is in a space like that and they have access to some of these ancient tools that I spoke to you earlier about, just a whole body massage, there's research that's shown that massaging the whole body raises oxytocin and lowers cortisol.
Well, there is that, as you're talking about, many wonderful ancient techniques that look at the physical body and ways to stimulate it and nurture it and support it. And there's also a lot of ancient, and they've been integrated into the more modern techniques, recognition of how we can work with the internal mental and emotional process and help people understand how, even though they haven't been trained to understand this or taught, they're actually creating their experience of life. And if we can empower them to understand that, give them some tools for creating it differently, then it starts to work together with that physical adjustment and balance in the system. And everything starts to work better, because as you're talking about it, I'm hearing what you're saying, that for you, the functional medicine approach is a very systemic approach, and the integration of various systems that need to be in balance. So when you look at, you've mentioned the yoga, is that a part of your personal practice? Is that something you recommend regularly for people?
Yes, doctor. So it's been 20 years of teaching now, and that 20-year journey actually was what kept me physically sane through a bad marriage, but it also was a way to support myself financially. But I do recommend, even today, when I see somebody with several issues, maybe lymphatic issues, immune system, the first thing that I say before you do anything else, just try and bring in a daily yoga practice, because it is so wonderful to improve digestion, to circulate the lymph, and therefore improve your immune function, help you with detoxification, lower the stress response, reduce cortisol, keep you in a state of calmness. And I used to joke about this 10 years ago to a group full of women, and I would tell them that if you ever have an argument with your spouse, don't respond right away. Go put your yoga mat out there and do an hour of practice, and then you just see it's amazing how suddenly your perspective shifts and you're thinking differently. You're no longer reacting from a space of negative um, lashing out, but instead you're able to differentiate between the message and the messenger, so things don't become as unpleasant. And I'm not saying that's denials, I'm just saying that take yourself away from a space where you feel overwhelmed, and that 1 hour of your practice can just make you think very differently. And I think I would advise this even if you're taking a very big decision about something. I think the space after yoga, when you're sitting in that silent space of meditation, which naturally gets induced in your mind after a yoga practice, is a great time for you to be looking at life altering decisions and taking them from a context of where you feel calmness, where you feel whole, and it's being guided from a space which is free of confusion and anything which is preventing a right decision.
The next thing I want to mention or ask you to talk about is you've talked about, having a sleep soul sister and this specialty you have related to sleep. Talk to us about that, if you will. What prompted that, and what kinds of interventions do you find most useful for people around sleep problems?
I think in the space of functional nutrition, there was a lot of talk about finding your niche. And I think I went against that for a very long time. I said, I don't want to become boxed into a space. I want to be able to help everybody. And then along the way, I started to find that it does help when you have a niche, because for one, your mind is not so fragmented. You start to bring focus into one space, and that made a world of difference. The reason I got into that space of sleep was that I had chronic sleep challenges right through this space of a bad marriage, because I wouldn't feel safe in my own home, so I would be awake pretty much the whole night, and I thought I was fine. So typically when somebody is in a situation like that, they've got this spike of adrenaline and that keeps them going. So it's not like they don't have the energy to go, but you also don't realize that has long-term detrimental effects. It raises inflammation and it makes you sick. It makes you dull. So there was so much that I couldn't understand, and there were friends around me who were popping sleeping pills, and they used to tell me that, hey, I've been taking this for 5 years, nothing's happened to me. But then they had so many health challenges. So I didn't want to go down that route of sleeping medication. So I started to go into it a little deeper and went into this focused area of sleep. And it was, I don't know if you heard about the Broken Brain podcast by Dhruv Purohit. So Dhruv
Yes.
is Dr. Hyman's business partner. And Dhruv actually on a call with me, he said, hey, you should start a podcast on sleep. And it was just that, to me, it was as if the universe spoke through Dhruv. So it was almost as if a button switched on. And the moment he said that, everything fell into place. So a few days after that, I found a producer in US and we got started with the Sleep Whisperer podcast. And it's amazing that it's only been 5 months, but the extent of knowledge that has come through the podcast, through so many experts all over the world, I think that's a beautiful space, and the world needs more sleep warriors or sleep soul sisters. So the sleep soul sisters is a joke between Dr. Aarti Surya, and there's one more of us called Dr. Nishi Bhopal, who's in the US. She's an integrative psychiatrist. And so we started to joke, hey, we're like the sleep soul sisters. We're all working towards this passionate area of sleep. And then we started this little informal group where we just ask each other advice when we're putting together programs, or we just feel that we can do a lot more for the world in terms of sleep if we are working from a space of collaboration and support for other experts in the same field versus a feeling of competition. Or I think when we come together, we can do a whole lot more.
Well, I'm looking forward to being able to interview Dr. Bhopal. How do we direct people to find your sleep podcast?
It's the Sleep Whisperer podcast, available on all podcast apps. So if you just put a search, Sleep Whisperer podcast, it's a black logo with a bright blue logo of a sleeping moon.
The Sleep Whisperer. Wonderful idea. All right, I will look into that, and grateful to have that as a resource. It is amazing when you start to interview people, the synergy that can get going. And
Yes.
so what's an area of your work that I haven't even asked you about that you want to make sure we talk to the audience about today?
I think we've spoken about the main areas, which are women's health and sleep. And I do a lot of work with adrenal function because of my understanding of the adrenals, thanks to my son's condition. So I believe there's a lot being spoken about everywhere about adrenal fatigue. And I have a whole lot more to say about that, but that's a long subject, so maybe we can't really go into that. But adrenal function is at the core of a lot of other conditions and anxiety. So when I hear anxiety, I'm immediately taken to adrenal function. And adrenal function can be disrupted for so many people because of what they are putting on themselves: restrictive diets, low calorie diets, not eating enough, not eating on time if they are not adapted to fasting, high periods of stress where the adrenals are simply so tired of pumping out cortisol, lack of sleep.
So with your holistic approach to that, or the functional medicine approach to that, is there a specific key for people with that adrenal problem that helps drop it down a few notches, like a simple general rule you could apply to people?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that I advise people, and it's very, very safe for most people to do, which lowers cortisol and the stress response almost in a few hours, is sitting in a bathtub of cool water versus a hot tub. So sometimes if somebody sits in a tub of cool water, and I'm not saying do this in freezing cold Boston or something like that, but if you can, if you're in a space where it's not excessively cold, and you can sit for half an hour in a tub of cool water with a little bit of boiled tea, to lower inflammation, and you stay there for about half an hour, I've found that it drops cortisol and it lowers the stress response, and then you're in a state of being able to make better decisions with other perhaps bigger intervention. But I would also say not having a restrictive diet. I mean, you don't want to, if you're in a period of high stress and adrenal dysfunction, you don't want to be doing something like jumping into a 5-day fast or going down a diet like ketogenic diet, which may be excellent for therapeutic reasons in certain aspects, but not when you're in that state of stress. So I would say begin with eating balanced meals where your plate can look as if there's adequate fat, fiber, protein, and color. So my mantra is always fat, fiber, protein, and color. So build your plate. Start the plate with 3 different non-starchy colored vegetables, and then add your protein, fat, and some complex fiber, not necessarily a grain, it could be sweet potatoes, but I think having balance in your meals and this sitting in a cool tub can be great ways to lower the stress response in a few days.
Excellent. Well, I thank you for taking time. I know it's quite a challenge. We talked about before we started recording that where you were going to be to record wasn't available, so you're doing it from your car. I appreciate you're putting yourself out that way and sharing your information with us. Again, we will send people to PhytoThrive, and I look forward to following your work.
Thank you, Doctor. It was a pleasure chatting with you, and I think time just flew by. And I know it's late in the night for you. It's probably time that you should go to bed and get some sleep.
I will definitely do that. I'll be doing some good self-care. I'll take some advice from you and get some balance in my life after this. But I appreciate your taking the time and working with me through the big time difference. And again, it's an honor to meet you, and thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Deepa Kannan is a Yoga Acharya for over 2 decades, a functional nutritionist, and a certified food and spirit practitioner. She brings together 2 decades of her experience in therapeutic and transformational yoga and deep learning in functional medicine nutrition to her practice in PhytoThrive. Functional medicine has been listed as the #1 trend for 2019 by Forbes magazine and is at the forefront of cutting-edge healthcare today. PhytoThrive focuses on merging together the deep rationality of the functional medicine world with the deep symbolism of yoga and ancient wisdom. Deepa brings together the masterful understanding of the human anatomy with cohesive understanding of physiology to offer what can be classified as true bio-individual mind, body, and spirit nutrition. Deepa has articles shared by Dr. Mark Hyman, MD, a 13 times New York Times best-selling author. She's done opening speech on health hacks at Amazon Web Services and Your Story Health Tech in 2019. She's hosted interviews with Dr. Dina Minich, a 6-time author, and Jessica Drummond, founder of the Integrative Women's Health Institute. She's a writer for health articles on Your Story Media, and Deepa is the host of the Sleep Whisperer podcast with guests from around the world. Dr. Mark Hyman says of her, "My friend Deepa Kannan explains the best ancient tools accessible to most of us at home to help support our glymphatic system." Dr. Mark Hyman, MD.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.